Welcome back to the American Zone. I'm your host, Griffin. We are tracking seismic developments out of Ottawa and Washington today, a story that is sending geopolitical shockwaves across the globe. President Trump has just put Canada's leadership on blast, making a direct and unapologetic play for the nation's immense freshwater reserves. And as you'd expect, the reaction north of the border has been nothing short of chaos. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government is in full panic mode, fumbling to justify its position while facing a furious backlash from its own agricultural and energy industries. Internationally, this is being seen for exactly what it is, a strategic masterstroke by an American leader who acts, while his Canadian counterpart is once again caught completely unprepared, paralyzed by indecision. Let's dive right in. The devastating wildfires raging across Southern California have ignited a fierce new debate, putting a spotlight on President Trump's recent remarks concerning Canada's most precious natural resource. He pointed out that countless millions of gallons of freshwater flow untapped from Canada's melting snowcaps, stating that our northern neighbor possesses what amounts to a massive, controllable spigot. The president's implication was clear, that vast water supply could be rerouted to drought-stricken states like California, permanently solving their water scarcity issues. This has, unsurprisingly, amplified concerns about the glaring inadequacy of Canada's current water protection policies. Here to help us unpack this is Tricia Stanek, a leading expert in hydrologic modeling. Welcome. Now, the consensus is that the president is referencing the Columbia River, a colossal 2,000-kilometer waterway that originates in British Columbia before coursing through Washington and Oregon on its way to the Pacific. What exactly is this spigot the president is talking about? In reality, there isn't a literal faucet. What the president is skillfully highlighting is the untapped potential. The immense power of that river's flow could be captured before it empties uselessly into the ocean. This would be accomplished entirely within United States territory, without ever needing to cross into Canada. He is proposing the construction of a new diversion pipeline, something that does not yet exist, to channel that water to the parched landscapes of California. Some have tried to frame this as Canada simply letting water run into the sea, but that narrative is misleading. That very same water is already a critical engine for American industries, powering everything from fisheries and farming to hydroelectricity. And let's be clear, American interest in Canadian water is not a new phenomenon. A pivotal report from 2008 explicitly warned Prime Minister Stephen Harper's administration that it needed to do far more to safeguard this vital resource. So, why this renewed, intense focus from the U.S. now? It boils down to one thing: securing America's economic future. This is a strategic investment in national growth, not just for a growing population's water needs, but for foundational industries like Silicon Valley. Operating those massive supercomputers requires an astonishing amount of water, as does our agricultural heartland. Canada, due to its low population density, possesses a surplus of fresh water it cannot possibly use. President Trump sees this not as a problem, but as a golden opportunity. And there you have it. Donald Trump has never been shy about prioritizing America's needs. And this week he delivered another masterclass in leadership. Standing before the world in Washington, he issued a directive that sent a jolt of panic through the halls of Ottawa. Canada must turn on the taps. He wasn't subtle. He pointed to the Great Lakes, the rivers that straddle our border, and even Canada's untapped northern reserves, labeling them the most squandered resource on the continent. But he went further, elevating this from a simple request to a matter of absolute national security. America's farms, its cities, its industries require an ironclad guarantee of water. Washington will no longer stand by idly, while Ottawa selfishly hoards a resource the entire world is desperate for. The ultimatum was crystal clear and deeply unsettling for the Canadian government. For generations, water has been a sacred, untouchable topic in negotiations, kept off the table even during the most intense trade disputes. With one move, President Trump just obliterated that outdated convention. He described Canada as a giant faucet. A faucet, he warned, that could either flow in partnership with the United States or remain shut off, risking being rendered completely irrelevant. British Columbia's government has confirmed that the United States has officially hit the pause button on all negotiations concerning the massive Columbia River Treaty. The administration has stated it is conducting a full review of all its international agreements. This treaty, which has been in place for decades, is the cornerstone of cross-border cooperation, governing flood control, hydroelectric power generation, and water allocation. The river's headwaters are in Canada, but its journey takes it deep into the American states of Washington and Oregon. An agreement in principle for an updated treaty was actually reached by negotiators in mid-2024, with the final terms hammered out by December of that year. But, critically, that left insufficient time for the deal to be ratified by the U.S. Congress before the new administration took office. And in a recent call with former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, President Trump minced no words, calling the existing treaty profoundly unfair to the United States. It's right there in black and white. President Trump just delivered a cold, hard reminder of who truly holds the power in this relationship. He's leveraging the Columbia River Treaty, the vital pact that dictates power and flood management between our nations, to bring Ottawa to its knees. Negotiations have been dead in the water for months, and Trump has now made it clear that the freeze will continue indefinitely until Canada's leadership starts paying attention. The message is simple. America can just as easily cut off the power that Canada depends on as Canada can attempt to withhold its water. For President Trump's supporters, this was a textbook display of masterful negotiation, bold, decisive, and applying pressure exactly where it was needed most, on a Canadian political establishment accustomed to hiding behind hollow diplomatic niceties. For Prime Minister Carney, however, it was a trap he walked right into. He rushed in front of the cameras in Ottawa, attempting to project an image of strength and resolve. But to the rest of the world, he looked cornered, his posturing only serving to betray the profound weakness of his government. Within hours, the consequences began to ripple outwards. Financial markets reacted instantly. Farmers from Ontario to the prairies began demanding to know why their government was actively refusing billions of dollars in potential opportunities that Trump was dangling right in front of them. New pipelines, expanded shipping routes, and massive infrastructure projects. All of it represented jobs, investment, and growth. Yet, Carney's knee-jerk refusal slammed the door shut before a single meaningful conversation could even take place. Then came the damning comparisons from economic experts. They reminded the Canadian public that Ottawa already sells its natural gas to the U.S., only to watch Washington turn around and resell it to Europe for an enormous profit. The exact same scenario could unfold with water. Carney's stubborn stance isn't a defense of Canada. It's a direct threat that risks leaving his nation with nothing, while America inevitably finds another path forward. That is the entire story in a nutshell. Carney thought he was demonstrating strength, but to any objective observer, he looked like a provincial amateur playing checkers against a grandmaster playing chess. By refusing to engage, Carney didn't trap Trump. He trapped himself. And the longer he remains defiant, the more this painful reality will dawn on his own citizens. President Trump's announcement didn't cause fear in America. It ignited a wave of national energy. His demand wasn't seen as an act of desperation, but as one of profound foresight. Water security is the next great frontier, and Donald Trump is the first leader with the courage to confront it directly. From the agricultural sector to advanced manufacturing, industry leaders across the nation voiced their immediate and enthusiastic support. They recognized this push as a strategic necessity. America is expanding, America is building, and America requires resources to fuel its growth. If Canada refuses to be a partner, Trump has made it abundantly clear that the United States has the will and the means to pursue alternatives, and to do so with lightning speed. Nowhere did this message resonate more powerfully than in our border states. Governors throughout the Midwest and the Great Lakes region universally applauded Trump for finally holding Ottawa accountable. For years, these states have watched as Canada reaped the benefits of shared water agreements while shirking any genuine responsibility. Now, the dynamic has been completely inverted. With Trump at the helm, Washington is dictating the terms, and it is Canada that is now sweating what comes next. In the energy sector, the signal was unmistakable. Hydroelectric power, pipelines, infrastructure, everything is now on the table. Trump's team has put investors on notice. America possesses the technology, the capital, and the political resolve to achieve its goals, with or without Canada's cooperation. The shockwaves reverberating from this are not about American vulnerability, they are about Canadian exposure. Carney's blunder has created a catastrophic new reality. It is political malpractice on an epic scale. If Canada refuses to play ball, America holds all the leverage, and Ottawa is risking total isolation over yet another sector that could have injected billions into its economy and created countless jobs. This is insanity. The true political firestorm isn't brewing in Washington. It has already engulfed Ottawa. Carney's attempt to frame his refusal as a patriotic stand began to crumble almost immediately under pressure from within his own nation. Opposition leaders lambasted him, arguing that Canada had just arrogantly walked away from what could have been the most lucrative trade deal in a generation. Farmers demanded action. Premiers in the prairie provinces began to signal that if Ottawa was incapable of securing a deal, they would seek the authority to negotiate directly with the United States themselves. Suddenly, the cracks in the Canadian Federation have widened into giant, gaping chasms. I don't see how Carney can possibly fix this. Trump didn't have to do a thing. By simply making the demand, he forced Canada's political class into open conflict with itself. To American voters, it looks as though Trump has masterfully set the terms of engagement, and Carney has stumbled right into his trap, and he knows it. Meanwhile, in the United States, the move was a political triumph. Republican lawmakers have rallied behind the president's demand, calling it a common-sense position that is long overdue. Even some Democrats have privately conceded that water security is a challenge that no responsible leader can afford to ignore. Governors from California to Arizona praised Trump for saying publicly what everyone has been thinking privately for years. America cannot allow Canada to continue hoarding vital resources. In a single, decisive action, Trump transformed a Canadian refusal into a powerful American rallying cry. Carney thought he was standing tall for his country. What the world actually saw was a leader isolating his nation for all the wrong reasons, while America projected nothing but strength and unity on the global stage. This standoff was never going to remain a bilateral issue between Washington and Ottawa. Within hours of the announcement, the story was on the front pages in London, Brussels, and Beijing. Global leaders were quick to react. Not because they cared about Mark Carney's political pride, they don't, but because they understood the monumental significance of what President Trump had just done. He single-handedly elevated water from a domestic policy footnote to a premier global commodity, and he did it entirely on America's terms. Financial markets responded with breathtaking speed. Investors began reallocating their portfolios, with stocks in agriculture and water technology surging on the expectation of new, secure U.S. water supplies. Simultaneously, Canadian energy and infrastructure firms saw their market valuations plummet as analysts openly questioned whether Carney's stubbornness had just cost his country its best chance at securing long-term economic stability. In Europe, the reaction was blunt. EU leaders, already on edge over their energy dependence on Russia, saw the writing on the wall. They recognized the pattern immediately. First it was oil and gas, now it is water. And once again, President Trump positioned America as the world's decisive player, while Canada was left playing defense. Officials in Brussels even began to float the idea of opening direct talks with Ottawa about strategic water partnerships, a thinly veiled threat that Europe might try to bypass Washington if Carney remained obstinate. China, meanwhile, observed with keen interest. Beijing is grappling with its own catastrophic water crisis, with severe shortages threatening its farms and megacities. From their perspective, Carney's posturing looked less like strength and more like a massive opportunity. If Ottawa refuses to sell to Washington, perhaps it will sell to Shanghai. That possibility alone highlights the immense danger of Carney's position. Instead of reinforcing its alliance with its closest partner, he is risking opening the door to America's chief rivals. Even our NATO allies were unsettled. If Trump was willing to take such a hard line with Canada over water, what would he do with countries that failed to meet their defense spending commitments? Trump's demand was a warning shot to the entire alliance. The era of America tiptoeing around sensitive issues is over. Partnership with the U.S. is a two-way street. The result was a stark geopolitical realignment. Trump looked bold, strategic, and uncompromising, once again recalibrating the world's center of gravity back to Washington. Canada, by contrast, looked utterly isolated, a nation sitting on a treasure trove of resources but too timid too divided and too poorly led to leverage them. What was intended as a demonstration of Canadian sovereignty had morphed into a global spectacle of Canadian weakness. And in the high-stakes game of geopolitics, weakness is an invitation for disaster. In the aftermath, Carney's office desperately tried to spin the narrative, issuing statements insisting on Canada's sovereignty and floating ideas for new legislation to centralize control over fresh water. But this only revealed how defensive and reactive his government had become. The moment Carney slammed the door, the conversation didn't end. It simply moved beyond his control. Prairie premiers began openly discussing regional autonomy. Legal experts pointed out that under Canada's constitution, Ottawa's jurisdiction over resources isn't nearly as absolute as Carney pretends. What was supposed to be a clean, decisive refusal was quickly devolving into the beginnings of another messy, internal constitutional battle. Meanwhile, Trump's allies floated an even more disruptive idea: direct water-sharing agreements with individual U.S. states that border the Great Lakes. If Ottawa wanted to play hardball, Washington would simply go around them. Governors in Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin loved the idea. The news rattled Ottawa to its core because it exposed a simple reality, saying no doesn't make the problem disappear, it just shifts the negotiation to arenas where you have no influence. And that is the trap. Canada's leverage is evaporating by the day. The more Carney insists on centralized authority, the more his own provinces rebel. The more he refuses to negotiate, the more the U.S. explores side deals, leaving Canada's federal government completely sidelined. The nation risks being seen not as a proud steward of its resources, but as a dysfunctional partner incapable of managing its own affairs. The irony is staggering. In his attempt to make Canada look strong, Carney has triggered the exact opposite, a debilitating internal crisis that is fracturing his country and fueling regional resentment, all while handing Washington even more negotiating power. And while Ottawa is paralyzed by debate, America is already making its next move. Trump's team is signaling massive new investments in desalination, water recycling, and other advanced infrastructure. It's the classic strategy: negotiate from a position of overwhelming strength while simultaneously building alternatives. That way, whether Canada comes to the table or not, America wins. The future for Carney looks bleak. Every move he makes now risks further exposing his country's disunity, and every move Trump makes reinforces his image as a decisive leader with strength, options, and unwavering loyalty to his own nation. In global politics, that contrast is lethal. Make no mistake, water is the new oil. Whoever controls it in the 21st century holds the ultimate power not just over agriculture, but over cities, industries, and the destinies of nations. President Trump understands this. He is already integrating water security with national defense, infrastructure, and trade policy. He has positioned America as the player that doesn't just endure shortages, it dictates the very terms of survival for everyone else. At the end of the day, Trump's message wasn't just for Canada, it was a message about the future. The United States will secure the resources it needs: water, energy, trade with or without Ottawa's blessing. That isn't arrogance, that is survival. And in this new era, it is America that is writing the rules. That's all we have for you today. From all of us here at the Zone Media Network, I'm Griffin. Be sure to visit American Zone for all the latest news, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Take care. The New Geopolitics of Water, an analysis of a U.S.-Canada resource standoff. Introduction. The 21st century is increasingly defined by the geopolitics of resource scarcity. While discussions have historically centered on fossil fuels, a more fundamental commodity is emerging as a focal point of international tension: fresh water. The hypothetical yet plausible scenario of the United States demanding access to Canada's vast freshwater reserves serves as a potent case study for this new era of hydropolitics. Such a standoff would transcend simple economic negotiation, touching upon the foundational principles of national sovereignty, the immense complexities of environmental stewardship, and the stability of the long-standing U.S.-Canada relationship. Analyzing this potential conflict requires moving beyond simplistic narratives of aggressors and victims to understand the intricate web of economic drivers, political pressures, and profound consequences that would define such a historic confrontation. It represents a microcosm of a future where the flow of rivers could dictate the flow of international power, and where a shared border could become a line of contention over the planet's most essential resource, the American imperative: drivers of a thirst for northern water. The impetus for an American demand on Canadian water is not born from abstract ambition, but from a confluence of tangible and escalating crises within its own borders. The primary driver is the undeniable impact of climate change, which has intensified drought conditions, particularly across the American West and Southwest. States like California and Arizona, home to tens of millions of people and critical economic sectors, face a future of chronic water deficits. California's Central Valley, an agricultural powerhouse that produces a significant portion of the nation's food, is heavily reliant on water resources such as the Colorado River that are now dangerously depleted. Projections indicate that this is not a cyclical downturn, but a long-term shift towards aridification, presenting an existential threat to regional economies and food security. This environmental pressure is compounded by immense economic and demographic demands. The American technology sector, heavily concentrated in regions like Silicon Valley, is surprisingly water-intensive. Data centers, which form the backbone of the digital economy, require millions of gallons of water for cooling purposes. Furthermore, continued population growth in Sunbelt states places an ever-increasing strain on already over-allocated water systems. From this perspective, the vast, seemingly underutilized freshwater systems of Canada, containing an estimated 20% of the world's fresh water, appear as a logical, if provocative, solution. The political calculus in Washington would frame access to this water not as an act of aggression, but as a matter of national security and economic preservation. A leader facing agricultural collapse and urban water rationing would be under immense pressure to pursue any and all available options, recasting the issue as a pragmatic necessity for the survival and prosperity of the American people. The Canadian Shield: sovereignty, ecology, and national identity. From the Canadian perspective, an American demand for its water is a direct challenge to the nation's core identity and sovereign rights. In Canada, natural resources are intrinsically linked to the concept of nationhood, and the idea of ceding control over its water is viewed by many as tantamount to a surrender of sovereignty. This sentiment is not merely political posturing, it is deeply embedded in the national psyche. Water is seen not as a surplus commodity to be exported, but as a national heritage and a vital ecological endowment that must be protected for future generations. The political leadership in Ottawa would face overwhelming domestic pressure to reject any such demands outright, framing their refusal as a defense of the nation itself. Beyond the principle of sovereignty lie profound and potentially catastrophic environmental concerns. The large-scale diversion of water from major river systems, such as the Mackenzie or those flowing into Hudson Bay, would require engineering projects on a scale rarely seen in human history. Ecologists warn that the consequences would be devastating and irreversible. Altering the flow of major rivers could collapse delicate ecosystems, destroy fish habitats, impact migratory bird patterns, and fundamentally change the salinity and temperature of vital marine environments like the Hudson Bay. Furthermore, such projects could release vast quantities of carbon stored in northern permafrost, creating a feedback loop that would accelerate climate change, the very problem the diversion was intended to solve. The economic argument for selling water would be countered by the incalculable long-term cost of this environmental degradation, a price that future Canadian generations would be forced to pay. The Canadian federal position would therefore be a defense not just of political autonomy, but of the nation's ecological integrity. A fractured North. The complication of provincial politics. The narrative of a unified Canadian rejection is complicated by the country's federal structure, in which provinces hold significant constitutional authority over their natural resources. This creates a potential fissure between the national interests, as defined by Ottawa, and the regional economic interests of individual provinces. For a province like Alberta or Saskatchewan, whose economies are heavily dependent on resource extraction, a multi-billion-dollar water export agreement could be viewed as a transformative economic opportunity rather than a threat to national sovereignty. Provincial premiers, facing their own fiscal pressures and accountable to a regional electorate, might be far more receptive to negotiations than the federal government. This could lead to a scenario where American interests attempt to bypass Ottawa and engage in direct side deals with willing provinces, triggering a severe constitutional crisis within Canada. The ensuing conflict would pit province against province and the regions against the central government, creating a level of national disunity that would significantly weaken Canada's negotiating position on the world stage. The American strategy could thus evolve from a direct demand on the federal government to a more insidious tactic of leveraging Canada's internal political divisions to achieve its objectives. This internal dynamic is a critical vulnerability that an assertive American administration would be quick to exploit, transforming the dispute from a simple bilateral issue into a complex multi-front challenge to Canadian federalism. The high cost of flow, economic realities, and consequences. While the concept of diverting Canadian water south is simple in theory, the economic and logistical realities are staggering. The infrastructure required, including massive pipelines, pumping stations, and reservoirs, would represent one of the most expensive engineering projects in history, with credible estimates placing the cost in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions, of dollars. Financing such an undertaking would be a monumental challenge, and the final cost of the delivered water would likely be far higher than that from alternative solutions like desalination, advanced water recycling, or aggressive conservation measures. The market impacts of such a deal would be equally complex. While certain sectors, such as engineering and construction firms, would stand to profit immensely, the broader economic consequences are less certain. For Canada, the influx of revenue would have to be weighed against the long-term risks. Commodifying water would subject it to market volatility and could lead to future trade disputes. Once the principle of water as an exportable good is established, it becomes difficult to turn off the tap, potentially locking Canada into long-term agreements that could be detrimental if its own water needs change. For the United States, while a new water source could provide a lifeline to at-risk industries, it could also create a moral hazard, discouraging necessary investments in sustainable water management practices at home. The economic debate is therefore not a simple calculation of profit and loss, but a complex analysis of long-term risk, opportunity cost, and the profound challenge of placing a price on an essential, life-sustaining resource. Conclusion: beyond the brink, the specter of a U.S.-Canada water conflict, while still hypothetical, serves as a critical warning. It illustrates a future where hydropolitics could supplant petropolitics as the dominant driver of international relations. The simplistic, nationalist framing of such a dispute, casting one side as a hero and the other as a villain, utterly fails to capture the profound complexities at play. The American need for water is driven by genuine environmental and economic pressures, while the Canadian resistance is rooted in legitimate concerns over sovereignty and ecological preservation. Ultimately, a zero-sum confrontation over water resources would be mutually destructive. It would damage the world's most successful bilateral relationship, destabilize the Canadian Federation, and set a dangerous precedent for resource conflicts globally. The true path forward lies not in aggressive demands and defensive refusals, but in deep, collaborative investment in 21st century solutions. This includes joint funding for water conservation technology, a shared commitment to mitigating climate change, and a modernization of century-old treaties to reflect new environmental realities. The ultimate test of leadership will be the ability to recognize that the water flowing across the 49th parallel is not a resource to be divided, but a shared trust to be managed and preserved for the generations to come.